We continue now at the top of Daf Yomi Gemara Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 89b. And the previous summit, the Gemara asked if the worker is allowed to singe the food with fire in order to eat more while he is working. We know the halach is he's not allowed to dip it into something in order to sweeten it in order to eat more. The question is if fire is the same or not. And the Gemara tried to bring a proof from a brisa because the brisa said that the worker is not allowed to eat, the worker is rather allowed to eat something in advance in order to whet his appetite. And so that should be the same thing as singeing it with a fire. And the Gemara says it's not the same thing at all. That the person should prepare himself to be able to eat. That's not a question. Of course he's allowed to do that. The question is here, can he prepare the produce? Can he prepare the food in some way, like by singeing it with a fire? So what's the halacha? And the Gemara continues to Ashma, come in here the following proof. The Brisa says, the workers are allowed to eat grapes at the end of the rows, as long as they don't singe it with the fire. And so here it seems clear, you're not allowed to singe the grapes with fire. And the Gemara says, Hasam over there, Mishum Bittul Malach, it had nothing to do with sweetening the grapes. There the issue is that they're supposed to be working, and they're taking time from working to essentially roast the grapes. That's problematic. Kikami Boilan, what we're asking is, Hey Chadika Ishta Uvanov, let's say his wife and his children are with him, and they're the ones that are going to be singeing the grapes. What would be the halacha in that situation where there is no Bittul Malacha? And the Gemara says, Tashma, come in here the following proof. It says in the Brisa, Lo Yahavev Bo'or, he's not allowed to singe it with the fire, V'yochal, and then eat. And similarly, the Brisa says, V'lo Yichmor Ba'adama V'yochal, he can't heat it on the ground and eat it. V'lo Yafrech al Gabi Aseli, he can't break it on the rock, V'yochal, and eat it. Aval Mafrech al Yad V'yochal, but he could break it by hand, one by one, and eat it. That's not a problem. And so again, it seems to be that you're not allowed to singe it with fire. And the Gemara says, Hasam over there, Misham Bittul Malacha, again, it's the same thing. The reason why it's not allowed is because of Bittul Malacha, because he's not doing his work. And the Gemara says, Hachanam Mistabra, it makes sense to say like that. Because if you think we're talking about sweetening the produce, so when he breaks it on the rock, what sweetening of the produce is there? Obviously, that's problematic, not because he's sweetening it, but because of Bittul Malacha. But the Gemara says to that, so that's not true. It's impossible that it's not going to sweeten a little. There is some sweetening even when he breaks it on the rock, and so therefore it could have been that that's what the Brisa is talking about. In any case, the Gemara is saying there is no proof from this Brisa. The Brisa could be talking about Bittul Malacha. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, come in here, another proof, Pa'alin shayu odrim b'ta'enim, v'godrim b'tamarim, uvotrim b'anavim, umoskim b'zeisim. If you have the workers, they're harvesting the figs, or the dates, or the grapes, or the olives, hare elu ochlim, they can eat, upeturim, and they're patur, sha'torah zichsa lehem, because the Torah says that they're allowed to eat the food while they're working. And the Brisa continues, Bepitam lo yochlu, together with their bread, they shouldn't eat these foods, elim ke not lu rishos mi balabayas, unless they got permission from the balabayas. And then it says, velo yispos b'melech v'yochel, they shouldn't dip these foods into salt and eat. And so therefore the Gemara is suggesting, just like they can't dip the foods in salt and eat, they also can't singe the produce in fire. And the Gemara says it's not a proof again. Melech v'adai kanavim v'davar acher dami. If you're talking about adding salt, so that's already like grapes and something else, that's a new ingredient, that certainly would be problematic. That's no proof to singeing it in fire. And Rashi explains, Achshure Gavra, to prepare himself to eat, L'hachin atzmo la'achila meruba, to prepare himself to eat a lot, Lo mi boilan, that's not a question for us. Sharei lo asra of Torah, because that, the Torah doesn't prohibit that. V'hai lav kanavim v'davar acher dami, that certainly would not be grapes with something else. Dehasam gabi anavim achshure piruhu, because by the grapes, that was talking about when you're preparing the produce, that's the issue. There's certainly no problem in preparing the person. Po'alin ochlin anavim, the workers can eat the grapes. Kol achilasan mashin at shemagin l'rosh umnius, they would always wait till they got to the end of the road to eat. Shein begoli, because then they were out in the open. V'hashemesh mako sanam umemaskan, and then the sun would beat down upon the produce and sweeten it. Rashi umnius is Rashi shuras akarim. Again, that's the end of the rows of the vineyard. Hasam misham bittul malacha, and then the Gemara said there in the Brisa, the reason why you weren't allowed to roast it was because of bittul malacha. The worker wasn't doing his work. Shemavatel atzmo kshemahav. When he's singeing the produce, he's being mevatel himself. He's not doing the work he's supposed to be doing. But the ika ishto uvana. But our whole question is, let's say his wife and his children are there. Shalom nizgru etzel balabayis. They're not hired by the balabayis. Umahavin lo, and they're the ones that are singeing it for him. And then it said in the Brisa, v'lo yichmor yechamim, he can't warm it on the earth. Shematminem ba'afar cham, he insulates it in warm earth. V'lo yafrich, and he can't break it kemosha osan l'tapuchim, like they do with the apples. Al yad, but he's allowed to do it little by little, miyad liyad, from hand to hand. Little by little is okay. Odrin, Moskin, Botzrin, Godrim, all of those languages languages are the same. Kulam lashon lekita hein lechol min v'min. They're all languages of plucking or harvesting, and they use a different word for the various species. And then it said in the Braisa upeturin, they can eat in their potter. What does that mean? Their potter min hamaiser means their potter from meiser. V'lo amrin on mekachu. We don't say that they're like buyers, that this is like a purchase. Lefisha ein zet tanai sechorn, because this is not a condition of their wages. Ela Torah zichzalem. The Torah allows them to eat. So since it's not considered like a condition of their wages, it's not considered like a purchase. That's why there's no obligation of meiser. And Rashi continues, bepitam lo yochlu. They shouldn't eat it with their bread. Mishum dina nakat le lefisha ochlin harbe. They can't do that because again it causes them to be able to eat more. And Rashi continues, lo yispos yitvo. The Brisa said he shouldn't dip it, talking about dipping it in salt. Kasal kadaitach. Rashi says right now we think mishum anavim v'davar acher kamar. The issue over here is that it's a problem of the grapes with something else. V'lo mishum meiser. This is not talking about an issue of meiser in the Brisa. The Brisa here is talking about the prohibition of having it with salt because that's davar acher. Alma achshure pira aser. And so the Gemara is bringing a proof from the Brisa. We see from here that preparing the produce is aser, and therefore again the Gemara assumes that singeing as well would be prohibited. And the Gemara answered to that, melech vadai kanavim v'davar acher dami. Salt for sure is like grapes with something else. That's a new ingredient. V'afagav de'alayu da'anavim kamevader le v'lav milsa b'apei navshi usafas. Even though this is together with the grapes, it's not like an independent accompanying food. Mikol makam davar acher. Still, it's another thing. Still, it's considered an additional ingredient. Aval mahavev eimolach deshari. But if he is singeing it, we might say that it is permitted. But the Gemara continues, v'lo yispos b'melach v'yochel. Is it true that he's not allowed to dip in salt and eat? Uriminu, but we have the following contradiction from a Brisa. The Brisa says, hasocher sapoel, if somebody hires workers, lador or lekaskes, tachas azesim. Rashi explains lador is lachpor, to dig under the olive trees, and lekaskes is lechasos sharashim hamagulim, to cover over the roots that are uncovered. So if the worker is doing this kind of work under the olive trees, harezeh lo yochal, so he's not allowed to eat. And Rashi explains, harezeh lo yochal min hazesim, he can't eat from the olives shebeilon, he can't eat from the olives on the tree, deboinan shas gemar malacha, because again, as we said, it needs to be the work that he's doing is the completion of the work. This is not at the completion stage of the work, and therefore he's not allowed to eat. On the other hand, the Brisa continues, Sachro livtzor, let's say they hire him to harvest. Livtzor is the word used as Rashi ba'anovim. They are hiring him to harvest grapes. Or Sachro limsok, they hire him to harvest the olives. Or Sachro lelaket, or they hire him to collect the other kinds of fruits. As Rashi says, limsok is bezesim. The word limsok means to harvest olives. Lelaket is beshar peiros, other produce that he's harvesting. Osan hanoshan al gavakarka, those that are left on the earth. He's collecting those fruits. So in that situation, hareza ochel, he is allowed to eat. That's considered to be work that is the gemar melacha. And furthermore, upater, he's also pater, he's exempt from any obligation of meiser. Sha'atorah zichzalehen, because it's the Torah that gives it to them. As we said, it's not considered like a purchase or like their wages. This is just something that is given over. It's a right that the workers have from the Torah. And the Brisa continues, katzatz, if he made a stipulation, and Rashi explains, katzatz v'hisna im balabayas, if he made a condition with the balabayas al menasha ochel, in other words, they made a condition that I'm doing the work on the condition that I'm allowed to eat. So havalei ke'ein mekach, that already is like a purchase. That's essentially part of his wages. And so in that case, the Brisa says, achas yochal, one by one he can eat, but shtayim lo yochal, two at a time, he is not allowed to eat. V'sofes b'melech v'yochal, and he's allowed to dip it in salt, and he can eat it. And Rashi explains, achas ochel, in a case of a stipulation, he can eat one at a time, the pachos b'shtayim, meaning less than two, lo chayil iser shem goren bedover, so there is no chalos of a goren, it's not considered to be like a granary, shalo nigmar malachto, that's not considered to be the completion of the work, and therefore there is no obligation of meiser. That's the point of the Brisa. But shtayim lo yochel, but two at a time already he can't do that. To shtayim mechimoti lehu milsa dechashivusa kagon katzitza o mekach, because two, when you have something chashiv, something important like setting it as a wage or a purchase, chayil alayu shem goren, that's called a goren. Kediyolef asmachta mikra lekaman, like we'll learn out as an asmachta from the pasuk later on. Ukviyusa de katzitza o mekach derabonani, and when you have that kind of fixed arrangement, that's considered derabbonan kedam and leil, like we say earlier, deimi doraisa, because on a doraisa level, ein chiluk mein shtayim la'achas, there's no difference between two and one. But the point over here there is that on a Durabonon level you have a goren if it's 2 at a time, and therefore you're going to have a problem of an obligation of meiser. And finally, the Brisa said, "V'sofes b'melech v'ochel," he's allowed to dip it in salt and eat it. Kasal kadaitach. Right now we think sefisa b'meiser lo mahanya, that sefisa, dipping it in salt, has nothing to do with meiser. So now we're going back to the issue of whether he can eat it at all and whether he can dip it in salt. V'lo nakat le ela lashmin de lo ma'akev le balabayis. And therefore, the point of this last line is to say that the balabayis can't stop him from dipping it in salt, and therefore it's a contradiction to what we said above. Because above we said he's not allowed to dip it in salt, and here we're saying he is allowed to dip it in salt. And so the Gemara continues, Ahaya, on which case is this last line in the Brisa going on, meaning the last line in the Brisa is that he's allowed to dip it in salt. What case are we going on? Ilema safe, if you're going to say we're going on the end where it was a stipulation that he's allowed to eat. So Kavan de Katzatz, if they made that as part of the stipulation that he could eat and dip it in salt, however he wants, he can make a stipulation to eat. Of course, he's allowed to dip it in salt in that situation. That was part of the stipulation of his wages. So Elalav, rather is it not, that last line of the Brisa is Aresh, it's going on the first case of the Brisa, meaning in terms of the general permission of a worker to be able to eat, and the Brisa is saying that the worker is allowed to dip it in salt, and that would be a contradiction to the Brisa above. And the Gemara continues, Amar Abaya says, Lokash, it's not difficult, kan ba'oretz, kan b'chutz la'aretz. In one case we're talking about in Eretz Yisrael, and in one case we're talking about in chutz la'aretz. And Rashi explains, kan ba'oretz, kan b'chutz la'aretz. In one case we're talking about in Eretz Yisrael, and in one brisa we're talking about chutz la'aretz, means as follows, Usvisa lav mishum anavim v'davar acher le'inyan dina nakatla. When we talk about dipping it in salt, in both brises, it has nothing to do with the prohibition of a worker having the grapes with something else, in terms of the halachas of what the worker is allowed to eat or not allowed to eat while he's working. That has nothing to do with what we're talking about in these brises. Elamisham chashivos achila. Rather, what we're talking about is lending importance to the act of eating, le'inyan meiser, in terms of the halachas of meiser nakale. That's what we're talking about. V'asefa koyan. In this brisa over here, we're going on the end of the brisa where he fixed it as part of his wages. And the difference in the two brises is, in one case we're talking about ba'aretz. We're talking about in Eretz Yisrael, the meiser do raisa. In Eretz Yisrael, meiser is do raisa. So hukva svisa. So then we say that the dipping it in salt, that establishes it as a permanent kind of eating. The svisa b'melach, gemar melach tayu, that the dipping it in salt becomes the gemar melacha, the completion of the work. The goli daita de lesle gor nachrina. He's showing that there is no other goren, there is no other stage for this food, and so therefore in the brisa over here we're going to say that it does establish it as obligated in meiser, but in the brisa above where we're talking about in chutz la'aretz, there's no obligation in meiser. As the Gemara continues, ba'aretz kava sefisa, in Eretz Yisrael, the dipping in salt establishes it as a permanent eating, and it's chayiv in meiser. But chutz la'aretz lo kava sefisa, but in chutz la'aretz, the dipping it in salt does not establish it as a permanent eating, and there's no obligation in meiser. But the Gemara continues, Amar Rava says, Mi'ika midi diva aretz kava svisa midoraisa, uva chutz la'aretz lo kava svisa mutar lechatchila. Doesn't make sense to say that in Eretz Yisrael, the dipping it establishes it as permanent eating on a doraisa level, but in chutz la'aretz, it's mutar lechatchila, it's not established at all, not even on a drabonon level. Do we make such a distinction, such a large distinction between Eretz Yisrael and chutz la'aretz? As Rashi says, mutar lechatchila, we're going to say it's mutar lechatchila bitmiya. The Gemara is asking this as a question. Heicha de meiser didei midrabonon. If you're talking about chutz la'aretz where meiser is drabonon, take valei sufisa midrabonon. So dipping it in salt should create a chiv drabonon. Techol de tikun rabonon kain doraisa tikun, because the drabonon is modeled after the doraisa. So it wouldn't make sense to say that dipping it in salt is a problem in Eretz Yisrael, but it's no problem whatsoever in chutz la'aretz. It should be a problem in chutz la'aretz, at least at a drabonon level. And so the Gemara continues, Elamar Rava, rather Rava says, bein ba'aretz, bein b'chutz la'aretz, whether we're talking about in Eretz Yisrael or in chutz la'aretz, chada lo kava svisa. If you have one fruit, the dipping in salt is not going to establish it as a permanent eating. But if you have two fruits, kava svisa, then the dipping in salt is going to establish it as a permanent eating. And so therefore, in the second brisa, katzatz, in the second brisa, when we say that he's allowed to dip it in salt, that's talking about where it was stipulated as part of the wages. And when it was stipulated as part of the wages, bein safas uvein lo safas, it actually doesn't matter if he dips it in salt or not. Achas ochel, he can eat it one fruit at a time. Shtayim lo yochel, he can't eat two fruits at a time. And so therefore, this second brisa is talking about where he's eating one fruit. And since he's eating one fruit, it doesn't make a difference if he's dipping it in salt or not. It is going to be permitted by one fruit. But lo katzatz, but in a situation where it was not stipulated as part of his wages, so there it actually makes a difference if he dips or not. Velo safas, if it's not stipulated and also he's not dipping it, so then ochel shtayim, he's allowed to eat two fruits at a time. But safas, but if he's dipping it in salt, achas achas ochel, he's allowed to eat one fruit, but shtayim lo yochal. Then already, since he's dipping it in salt, he's not allowed to have two fruits, and that's what the first brisa means, that if he's eating two fruits, he's not allowed to dip it in salt. That's already going to obligate it in meiser. V'afagav denotal rishus mi balabayis, and even if he has permission from the balabayis to eat it in that fashion, the itvil lehula meiser v'kava sefisa. Still, we're going to say that it's considered to be tevel. There's an obligation of meiser, and the dipping it in salt is going to make it that it's a permanent eating, and there is this obligation. That's why there was a prohibition in the first brisa to dip it in salt. And Rashi explains, Tarti kava sefisa, if you have two fruits, then dipping it in salt is going to create a permanent eating. Kidiyolef lekamon bepachas mishtayim lo have goren, like we're going to learn later on. Less than two is not considered to be goren. It's not considered to be the gemar melacha. Katzatz bein safas uvein lo safas. Now, if it was stipulated as part of his wages, so then it doesn't make any difference. The stipulation itself creates that obligation. Ketzitza mashvi goren. The ketzitza creates the goren kishein shtayim if there are two fruits. V'achas achas ochel shtayim lo yochel. So therefore, he can eat one fruit but not two. V'kevan de'achil al yedei ketzitza lesa b'shtayim. Now, since we're already saying once it's stipulated as part of his wages, he can never eat two. Ela biachas, he can only eat one. Lo kava behem svisa. So then the svisa, the dipping in salt, doesn't do anything by one. Mishum hachi katani sofis b'melech v'yochel. That's why the second brisa says he can dip that one in salt and eat. V'yasefa daf kakoy. It's going specifically on the end where we're talking about where it's stipulated as part of his wages. But in the first brisa, that's talking lo katzatz, where it's not stipulated. So velo safas, if he's not dipping it, ochel shtayim, then he's even allowed to eat two. Safas lo yochel shtayim, but if he dips in salt, he can't have two to cover svisa, because then we say again that the dipping in salt makes it like a permanent eating. Umishum hachi katani bebrisa kamaisa. That's why it says in the first brisa, velo yispos, that he's not allowed to dip it in salt. The lav bekatzatz. We're not talking about where it was stipulated as part of his wages. V'achilosa b'shtayim shtayim, and he's eating two at a time. And since he's eating two at a time, that's going to be a problem if he dips in salt. And the Gemara continues, V'tarti dekava svisa minolan. How do we know it specifically by two fruits that dipping it in salt is going to establish it as a permanent kind of eating? Amar of Masna says, the Amar Krutz, because the pasuk says, Ki kivsam, because he gathers them, ka Amar Gorna, like cut grain on the threshing floor. And Rashi explains, V'tarti dekava svisa minolan, kalamar minolan debinan tarti uvatzir lo. How do you know you need a minimum of two fruits? And the Gemara says to that, Ki kivsam ka Amar Gorna, the pasuk says he gathers them like cut grain on the threshing floor, ein goren below kibbutz, meaning it's not called a goren, it's not called a threshing floor without gathering. Vein kibbutz pachas mishtayim. You can't gather if it's less than two. That's how you know you need a minimum of two. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. Tanu Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, paros hamarachsos betua, when you have cows that tread on the produce. Rashi says, hamarachsos betua sheshorin saorin b'mayim. The case over here is they soak the barley in water, miyavshin osan betanur, then they dry it in the oven, vidashin osan beparos, and then they tread upon it. The cows step upon it, lohasr klipasan v'uchoshla, in order to remove the shells. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Tzadi Amud Aleph.